the temporary bracing of those piles and then the temporary compressed cathodic protection. I will say that temporary cathodic protection turns out to be pretty real. These photos I was just given are of the test piles we drove 3 years ago, which have not had any kind of cathodic protection on them, and they are already pretty weathered, so I'll pass those around for whatever those visuals are worth. But the way we procured the ITB was we said there are a bunch of optional additions. When you get all the way to the end, which we would be intending to do because we have enough money to do all the base bid and all of the options, you don't end up with this, you actually end up with the platform 2. So the way the train is moving down the station, we would end up with a completely functional trestle and a completely functional platform at the end of the next summer. What would that leave? Follow-on work for the next season then would be all these mooring and breasting dolphins. And then all the stuff that actually makes it fully functional. The piping that goes on top, hose towers in the core building, and the permanent cathodic protection. The new part of this is that it's kind of good news. We're getting more than we thought we could get for our money. But also the interim utility of that structure, if we are unable to find funds to keep going forward, is better than we thought. So in a real emergency, it would be nice to have the breasting and mooring dolphins so you could tie your ship up. But you could drop an anchor and hopefully keep that facility into some useful function. Okay, so with all that said, that's going to tee up a real question, which is coming your way. And I think that it's probably going to behoove all of us to have a special meeting of at least this committee or maybe of the whole to chat about it before we crash into it. But with the petroleum cement terminal and the ITB now closed and we're finishing that up, I think it's going to tee up at least 2 questions we should all chew on. First one is, if we go down this path, if we actually procure the $42 million, what is it going to do to the economy? Is this a sensible thing to do? And second is, double check, measure twice, cut once. Is this the right place to start? Do we even need this thing? And if we need it, do we need to start here? And so some preliminary thoughts on that. First is, we have definitely heard from the users a reaction to the tariff that we introduced to the world back in February and then brought to the Port Commission. So remember, our opening bid was, we have $128 million left over from the state grants that we've received from port equity. We added a little bit from a $20 million grant last year. We added a bit more port equity. Grand total, about $158 million. We don't have that much left because we spent a lot of it. If we need to go and get from the users by putting a tariff on the things coming across the petroleum cement terminal, if we need to find the rest of the money just through a tariff, what might it look like? This was the raised $200 million, backfill what they've borrowed from the cargo grant so far. And when we took that to the Port Commission and to the public, everyone became acutely interested in the effect that has on the airport. A lot of the airport's business is cargo business. I don't mean to be pejorative when I describe the airport as a cheap gas station. Well, I think I was a little bit pejorative when I did that. I didn't mean that. The reason the planes are stopping here is because the gas is cheap. And if we raise the gas price too much, there is good reason to think they will overfly us, they'll move somewhere else, and that's not good for anybody. The airport is something like 10% of the jobs in town, and once they go, it's virtually impossible for them to come back. So, our preliminary conclusion is if we use the cash on hand to build the first season, and then we crash into the second season with no additional help, we should not do this. This is too much. And there is a question from the users, which is not an unreasonable question. If you build half of it, and you use just the cash on hand that you have, doesn't it make this kind of inevitable? Aren't you going to be forced to do some version of this to us? And I think our answer is no, and we're trying as hard as we can figure out how to signal that. So we suggested to the Port Commission that they begin that signaling by saying, if you get to the point where you got to find the rest of the money for the petroleum cement terminal, you shouldn't do it just by those tariff adjustments, because we don't think those are compatible with ongoing operations at the airport. And more generally, we shouldn't do tariff adjustments that are actually going to cause economic harm. And the administration, we are completely on board with that as well. If we bring the procurement to you, it will likely come with a resolution that expresses all of our sentiment that we cannot do this just by jacking the rates on everything that's coming across the dock base. And I think there our interests are totally aligned, because not only would it be a bad idea to do that to the economy, to say, well, we got this thing 3/4 of the way built, we need to raise the cash to build the last quarter of it, let's just jack the tariffs and see what happens. Not only could that actually damage the airport, but it could also make us go bankrupt, because the only way this system works is that we assumed a flat level of demand. If we actually crater the petroleum that's coming into the Port of Alaska, we can't pay our bills, and then we go bankrupt. So it's not good for society, the public generally writ large, but it's also acutely bad for us. So we really can't proceed in this direction. So as to the first question, what does it do to the economy? Our answer is going to be, we are only going to be proposing, if we propose to go ahead, to use the cash that we have. And then after we have used the cash that we have to procure the first season, we are not going to signal, and we're doing our level best to tell everybody, that does not mean tariff increases that we have proposed are inevitable. And in fact, we are going to race between now and then to find some state funding, to find some federal funding, maybe to find some very attractive financing through ADA or others. But if we have to pause, we would pause then, because we are not just going to run over the precipice like lemmings. So if we don't have more money to finish the petroleum cement terminal, that's the point where we are definitely going to say, everybody's got to slow down. We're not just going to set this all on fire.
Yeah, hold on. So basically, Davidson has arrived, just for the record. Mr. Dunbar has a question.
Why? This strikes me as an approach that has a considerable amount of risk, in the sense that, we say we will find more resources, right? The ADA financing, I think that sounds like the easiest to obtain, right? Well, easier than just saying the state's going to give us a grant. The state doesn't have a functioning capital budget right now.
Right.
So why not have a smaller tariff increase, something that we think the economy can sustain immediately, and try to do it all? But the port and these different terminals should, to a certain degree, pay for themselves. Obviously, they can't do it completely. We know that. But if we're doing this upgrade, why not have a small tariff increase that we think is sustainable, and then maybe it takes a few years for that small tariff increase to make an appreciable difference, but at least we have some revenue stream aside from us hoping that we can get outside financing.
So through the chair,
and doing it up front, right?
Yeah.
Rather than saying we're going to spike you, we'll do a small one now, along with spending all of our own cash.
Yeah, so through the chair, I think I have a lot of reactions to that. One is, I'm not really sure that it pays for itself is the right model here, in the same way that we don't have toll roads everywhere. We just build the roads. We don't say all the users are going to pay for the roads while they're using them. Second is, it might behoove us to say that we're going to do some smaller tariff increase, just to sort of get accustomed to the fact that we're not going to rely on somebody to completely bail us out. But I don't know, as I stand here now, what that is, because we're hearing from the airport community that what seems to be very minor tariff adjustments really could cause domino effects at the airport. And if this is too damn high, I don't know what is not too damn high right now. And there's no reason for me to start fiddling with the dial until I raise it, unless the dial is going to raise enough money that I can finish. It doesn't help me to start to turn the dial and get $20 million. Because I can't and build 3 more dolphins. That doesn't really do much for me. So where I think we are is, we want to proceed cautiously with the precautionary principle in mind. We don't want to leap before we look. And I think where we are now is, we do not know enough about what happens when we move the dial in any course adjustment kind of way. Maybe that's the conversation when we get to the point where, hey, there's a federal grant, but there's a local match. Where's the local match going to come from? We'll sort those out. But that's, I guess, the best answer I have.
Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Sure.
Quickly. The assumption you're making is that somehow we have landed on the best possible version of the tariff. I understand that we need more data, but how do we know that we have this tariff amount? How do we know that a small increase will have a devastating effect? And conversely, then why don't we lower the tariff slightly and have even more business at the airport? What we're saying is that somehow we've magically landed on the only possible acceptable tariff amount, and I don't think that's true.
Yeah, so that's correct. And I guess I have a couple more things to say about that. First is, if we were forced to do a tariff adjustment, we already know how we could make this more palatable just by saying we'll take all the grants that we were kind of reserving for the cargo terminal and we'll push them all to the petroleum cement terminal. And that'll drop it by like half because they're not enough to get us through the cargo terminal, so we may as well put them to a useful aim right now. But the bigger answer is, this is not the question of the moment, right? So the question of the moment is, what do we do with the cash on hand and how do we proceed? If we get stuck, if we get to the point where we've built 3/4 of the petroleum cement terminal and we don't have the cash on hand to do the final quarter, then we have these hard conversations and then we have discussions about what is an acceptable tariff. We're just not there yet because we're hoping that we will be able to find a way that we can all sort of sing Kumbaya, either through an ADA financing play or through more federal grants or something. I mean, what would be nice is if we never really have to have an impossible conversation where we go, this is what we are doing to you, what's going to happen. But that's not, we're not there yet. We haven't reached that moment.
So, Ms. Quinn Davidson was in the queue, but Ms. LaFrance has arrived. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bill, apologies since I'm late, maybe you covered this, but how in other jurisdictions are ports funded? Like, what's the percentage of tariffs versus local subsidization or state or whatever? Have you looked at examples and do we sort of line up with that? Or?
Through the chair, that's a good question. I know that for ongoing operations, most everybody is paid through tariffs and dockage and wharfage. When you come to build a port anew, I will confess, I don't have a statistic for you. That might be one that we just have to research.
The challenge really when it comes to financing is because we are a one-way port. Stuff comes in, very little goes out. You think about places like Oakland or Long Beach where they have stuff coming and going all day long. Their volumes are enormous.
So they're charging more tariffs because
They are actually probably charging similar tariffs. The challenge is, think about it just in terms of capacity. We're 40% utilized right now, and these places are 80% plus. So it's just they do so much more volume that they can support through their tariffs the cost of building these facilities. And they're built by borrowing the money and building it and paying it.
And that voice was Mr. Slivka for the record. Mr. Welton.
Yeah, I just want to address Forrest's point on did we land on the magical tariff? And I think what happens is you set a tariff and then the industry and everything revolves around that and their contracts, what happens. So it becomes the equilibrium point. And what we're hearing is you bump it up, that throws the equilibrium off. And if we lower it, you may not gain much because they're saying once they quit flying into, international, they stay with whatever pattern they are in other airports. So it wasn't magical when it started, but it became magical.
I think Mr. Dunbar's question was close to the right question, but it wasn't the right question. Ms. Salato's done. I'll reframe that question slightly. I'll reframe it slightly because you hit on the core question closely, but
I'm diverting from tariffs, so if you want to.
I do. Okay. So I think actually, Mr. Falsey, when you suggested that we don't know what happens when you turn the dials and everything, I think the real question isn't about where do we set the tariff, but when do we pause, right? Because there's an assumption operating here that if we begin, then we can figure out all the parts after. But the question really is, do we begin until we know the parts, right? And so, because there's substantial risk, it appears, in picking an element and then building until you have no money and then finding the money, or figuring out exactly what you're going to build and then figuring out the money and then building it. And so I think that's the challenging question that we have to get to the core of. So it's not so much about the tariff, but it's about what's the what. We're still struggling with that.
And my follow-up question on that is, how can we use our process, our invitation to bid process, so we're not, if we pause getting a contractor coming back saying we have cost increases now because of the delay and the materials are costing more, because I think I'm more comfortable when we know we're all in and what the all-in amount is, and so it doesn't just creep up. And when we pause, then we also have to deal with market fluctuations and other things occurring. So yeah, I have some similar concerns.
Some of that I think I'll address in the next set of slides.
Other questions?
Thank you. Okay, so that was our first question. What the heck are we going to do to the economy if we procure the first phase? Our answer is nothing, so long as everyone understands that it does not make tariffs inevitable, and it shouldn't. and we will do whatever we can do to get everyone to understand that. Second question is this the right place to start? So remember how we got here. After the failed federal project, we had two design charrettes. One was late 2014. Coming out of 2014 and in early 2015, that was the path that set us on this. So we had the big conversation. We said, what do we want to build and how do we want to build it? Sequencing is the big challenge because the port has to stay open while it's being rebuilt. And the direction that we were sent off in 2015, before we were even here, this is the tail end of the Sullivan administration, was start with what was then called the new POL1. So that's what we have been doing. The procurement and the design and the permitting effort has all brought us to here. So measure twice, cut once. Does it actually make sense to do that? And can we make that decision before we know what the rest of it looks like? I think the pitch that we're going to tee up for everybody is yes, we can, but that's a real question, and we're all going to have to chew into that together. And the beginning of that story is, remember what we got. We got this Terminal 1, which is got some petroleum and cement capabilities, Terminal Petroleum 2, then what's called the Matson berth, and then what's called the Tote berth, and then this old Northern Extension failed federal project to the north. We also have this South Floating Dock, which is not labeled here, so it's a swear. So this is the stuff we care about. This is the stuff that is old. This is the stuff we want to replace. If you want to replace that, you got to make some space because you can't take a facility out of commission while also rebuilding the facility. So if you got to make some space, there are two options. You could go to the north. We don't think that is going to prove up to anybody, and it certainly failed in the 2014 charrette for a couple reasons. The first is, if you can see the rest of the geography, the inlet kind of curves around here at Carn Point. So when you get further into the inlet, you get further to the north, it gets narrower and it gets faster. So the pilots, who are all capable, are all going to say, I'm not going to tell you it's impossible, but it is going to be a professional challenge, and moving from 2 knots to 5 knots means I'm not 100% confident I'm going to keep the boat stable there. If you did do that, which is not impossible, it would be, I think, a temporary facility. There are some phasing ideas that were tossed around in 2013 and 2014. We've spent some money to move Tote to the north, because this is the Tote yard up here. So you could use some part of this backland if it's not unstable, plus that. Just temporarily get them out of the way. Now you've made space. Now you can do some sequencing. We have done back of the envelope kind of calculations. We suspect that is going to be way more expensive and not attractive from a safety or operational point of view, because you got to store up a lot of soils, you got to do a lot of work, and you got to build a temporary thing that you're ultimately going to destroy. So the other option is go to the south, and that's of course the option that we have picked. And we think that proves up for a bunch of reasons. The two of them are, if you're moving the petroleum and cement facilities, cement ends up moving to its big cement dome. So I heard from the round table when we spent our quality time together last week that we currently are dragging cement like the longest distance in North America, or pretty close to it. So this gets it right up to where it needs to go. Hopefully it shortens their offloading time. They're closer to their facility. And of course, that is a permanently useful thing. We start the process, we start the carbon following, and that by building something we're going to keep. That's the path we're on. And a reminder of where we are in that process. We've already spent the money to relocate the South Floating Dock, so we picked it up and moved it to the south. We've already done the shoreline soil stabilization, because remember, this is all based on land that we created in the federal project. And by the way, that worked. In the earthquake, the soils around the part that we stabilized cracked, and the soil we stabilized didn't crack. So that was encouraging. And then we spent $20+ million doing the transitional dredging to make this facility usable in this location. So we're pretty far down the path. And that's where the petroleum cement terminal gets sent out to bid and is potentially coming to you guys. Now there is a big, huge question. Do you do this when you don't know what the rest of this looks like? And I think that we are inviting all eyes on this, but we have some confidence that the answer is yes. Because there is, as yet as we have been able to determine, no iteration of the final version of the port that doesn't end up with the petroleum and cement terminal. There's been a lot of ideas. You could hang fuel vaults off of the cargo terminals. I'm not sure what you do with cement in that version of the equation. But we have not yet seen a map or a back of the napkin envelope drawing at all that shows any final version of the port. So without a petroleum cement terminal. If there is one, we will definitely look at it, because there is no sense in running as fast and as hard as we can directly into a wall or over a cliff or into a buzzsaw. But from all of the options that we have looked at, from the 2013 charrette, the 2014 charrette, from the utilization rates that we have now, it just seems like all roads start with building the petroleum cement terminal, whatever comes next. And I will say that whatever comes next is definitely fluid. There's open questions about how many cargo terminals you build. There's open questions about whether you can marry the petroleum facilities to the cargo terminals. That actually is one of the ideas that came up in our roundtable in the last 2 days and from our conversations with the users. It seems really attractive, because if we could put more petroleum capabilities on the cargo terminals, you potentially delete the petroleum terminal out of the project altogether, and that's $175 million. So, we're also in a place we are just acutely worried about the facility we have, and that's for two reasons. The first is it's getting weaker and weaker. So this is a memorandum that we got just before the roundtable, actually, June 12th, where as we've been doing more and more earthquake tours, one of these piles I think is now named the constant pile. We're finding more damage of a sort that we hadn't seen before, and it's disturbing because it's starting to cluster in some places. When it clusters in some places, then we're actually starting to derate portions of the facility. And the engineers tell us there's not like a model that you create. The port doesn't exist in a computer where we can sort of delete out different piles and see what cascading problems it occurs. There's a lot of professional judgment in this, and so as we're looking at damage to the facility, the way it kind of ends could be quickly. It may just be that a row of piles failed, and then the neighbors failed, and the neighbors failed, and it's sort of catastrophic. So seeing cluster damage is not reassuring, and it has led to engineering recommendations. We're now derating it. So the facility used to be rated for 600 pounds per square foot. We're now saying 200 pounds per square foot to say just don't park heavy equipment there. And the petroleum terminals are now experiencing observed damage that we hadn't seen before in clusters, and they have not had the same level of jacketing and bandages and stuff that the cargo terminals have. So the first thing that gives us some concern is that the thing that we have is super fragile, beyond its useful life. We would like to hurry up and get it replaced. The second is the vestigial memories of all of us on November 30th who woke up in an earthquake, and I called Steve Buffo and said, "Is the port in the water?" I sort of stared into that abyss, and I did not like what I saw. So even if we were able to bandage this up, we still live in a seismically skeptical environment where this thing's got to be robust in addition to not just falling down on its own. So that gives us some sense of urgency. Now we had the roundtable where we chatted with all of the users for 48 hours-ish, 2 days. I think it was productive. We've definitely heard some good ideas that we are absolutely trying to roll into the design for the remainder of the facility. I'll say, and one of them is that petroleum terminal. I think we are increasingly moving to the idea that one can delete. That if we could get down to a cargo solution that also accommodates petroleum on the side, then having a separate PCT gives us the petroleum redundancy we need. I think we're going to see this number start to get shaved down as we have increasing conversations. And the good news is, I think the users have been very collaborative, and I think there's an ongoing engagement, commitment to be very collaborative going forward. I'll say candidly, they're not there yet. On the questions, is it okay to proceed with just the cash we have without signaling that there's going to be more tariffs to come? And are they convinced that the petroleum cement terminal is the thing we need in the right place to start? I think we still have more work to do there. And that's why I suspect there'll be a need for more of these meetings ahead of anything coming in July. But we feel pretty confident there is. We're inviting. If there is a version of the final state of the port that does not involve the petroleum cement terminal, somebody send it to us. Give us a piece of paper.
Thanks. So we have 22 minutes left and want to hear from the consultants and leave a few minutes for public input. So for this part of the debate, we can have a couple questions and let's try to hone them down as much as possible. Ms. Zalatel and then Mr. Walton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So how much do we have to spend to keep the petroleum terminal going, in this time while we wait to make the decision, or even during the construction phase? And is that going to eat into our cash on hand, or is that already built into the port's budget?
So I think I might phone a friend and ask Sharon Walsh to tell me the answer to that. I mean, we have ongoing maintenance costs that we are spending.
Could you repeat the question?
So how much is it going to cost? How much are we going to need to spend to keep the petroleum terminal going as we're seeing this clustering? Is it going to eat into our cash on hand, or is that already well within our budget?
Well, we have operating budget, and we've been set aside traditionally $3 million a year to jacket pilot. Then, if you recall, a couple of years ago, we had a fender piling fall off the dock, a whole assembly that was really nerve-wracking. We paid divers to go see what the rest of the fenders were like. We determined we need to deal with those as well, so we've cut it in half. We have half of our money, our $3 million a year operating, goes to the pilot jackets, half is going to fender assemblies. And we're working on that. But this new damage that we have, the 6th pilot, we've now had to order 6 jackets for the POL2. That's the corkscrew ones you saw. Those are $32,000 a piece installed. That's 6 times 32,000. That's a couple $100,000. We don't have operating level that kind of money forever. We'll probably be coming to you for additional jackets because the 3 that you just saw, the Chris Consto pile, we call it, because you discovered it on your boat, right? And the 2 neighbors that were discovered after is being also having cracks in them. Those have to be a special order pile because they're diameter. I'm still waiting for a price back on that. Again, it's $30,000-$40,000 per pile. So in our operating money, we can accommodate some of it. When we get into cash on hand for the project, we've kept that separate. It's been dealt with financially as this is project money encumbered to the project, this is operating. So,
and further on the finances, I mean, to be candid, we're going to have to do that no matter what, right? Like, that's going to have to happen whether we pause or don't pause. The money that we have that is 128 is grew to 158. The lion's share of that, all but about 30 million of it, were state grants for the not for rehabilitation, but for the replacement. So that money can only be used to build new facilities. I guess it's about $30 million of port equity that we put into the program that I guess we might have to start cycling bits of that out if we run out of port equity or fund balance. But we can do more research and figure out when the crossover point happens.
Mr. Weddleton.
So if you built a new petroleum and cement thing, like you said, it's a lot closer to the fuel tanks and to the terminal. So is it more efficient for the shippers? And maybe we increase the tariff to pull that if it saves them $1,000 a visit or $500 or something. Is that something you can measure and say, okay, we're going to bump your tariffs up so that's equal, then we get some income from that?
So through the chair, it is more efficient. I don't know that I know exactly how more efficient. I guess you could figure out how to take away all the efficiency by saying now your dockage, the amount of time you're spending at the dock face is less. So we will up the wharfage, the tax on the stuff that's coming through so that you're at net zero. We haven't really talked about that. I'm not sure that's our first choice, but I guess it's theoretically possible to figure out how to do that.
Mr. Omar, last question before we move on.
Yeah, so if we are worried about the sort of elasticity associated or the economic effects associated with the increased tariff on fuel, but we are building this in a certain way and moving it at a certain time, not just because of the fuel and cement, but because of the overall port project. Has there been a consideration, and I guess I don't know how the tariff is structured exactly, can you increase the tariff on things other than fuel and other than cement to help pay for this part of the project?
Student Chair, the answer is definitely yes. And so you may recall back in February, we brought you a tariff proposal that said we're going to do every part of the facility pays for itself. That is a design choice. We could now say there is a tariff on cargo that initially is going to backfill petroleum and cement. We haven't done that because in some ways you ultimately arrive at the same place. If the whole facility is going to pay for itself, I mean, without cross-subsidization, you arrive at the same place. If we're ultimately going to build the cargo facilities and the petroleum cement facilities, it costs what it costs. We could raise the funds from the petroleum cement users immediately to pay for their part, or we could start raising everybody. But eventually, the whole thing gets paid by everybody. And unless there's cross-subsidization, unless cargo is paying for petroleum and cement, then it comes to the same place. Now, you could cross-subsidize. There's no reason why you couldn't do that.
Can I add a quick follow-up then? I think that's actually perhaps something you should seriously consider, and the reason is because there's a couple reasons. One, I don't think anybody thinks it's going to fully pay for itself. The project as a whole, with $2 billion, is not going to come from the tariff. We're going to find funds elsewhere, and it's sort of arbitrary which parts of the overall construction are going to get federal grants or get state grants or what have you, right? It's not really based on the merits of the users or the users themselves. At the same time, a lot of jobs in Anchorage are tied to the airport. So I understand why we're uniquely sensitive to impacting the fuel at the airport. However, the goods that are sent to the rest of the rail belt, right? This is the Port of Alaska, and the rest of Alaska has sort of refused to accept that and to help us with this, right? If we were to raise the cost of goods on other things that go not just to Anchorage but to everyone, then everyone shares in those costs, right? And it's a little bit heartless, but not really. It's a realistic reflection of what we are trying to do, which is to create an effective port for the whole state of Alaska, or at least the vast majority of Alaskans, right? So why not use that cross-subsidization on goods other than fuel to help pay for this?
So the answer is, Blue Chair, maybe. But preliminary thoughts are, first, that I'm not sure how much of the petroleum is mostly used at the airport. But the cement is, of course, statewide. We're like 80% of the cement that's coming into the state. But even, however that all works out, the punchline I want to give you now is I have no recommendation to change the tariff for you today at all, and I'm not anticipating any tariff recommendations until we have spent a good amount of time trying to find other funds. So these are all good conversations. These are all coming attractions, maybe, of conversations we're going to have. But the question for the body now is just what do we do with the cash on hand? And I don't want to get confused on what the future tariffs may be, because that is only going to be informed when we have a better sense of what external monies are coming into the program.
And what project we're going to build, which is probably...
Which for the remainder of this is, I mean, even if we were all at Kumbaya for we're ready to go with building cement terminal, then there's no Kumbaya on the remainder. We've made the space to fix the remainder, but there's a lot of discussions about whether the tow dock should even have a platform, or whether it can just have trestles, whether it has fuel vaults, et cetera, et cetera.
So, there's many questions still to be answered. And just on behalf of the folks in the cement industry, there is a point as well where people will stop building, which has the same net effect because construction jobs are all over the state. And so the impacts are comprehensive and universal, not narrowly constructed around one industry could benefit more or less. Okay, now let's have Ascent come on up and give us the briefing on their work. Maybe 8 minutes or 9 minutes with questions, because we want to at least have a couple of public comments. We have another committee.
I know, it's my committee.
Okay, then we can go a little bit long. Sounds good.
Our committee, sorry.
You said it sort of right, but not quite.
Hey, I didn't say that he didn't say it right, so it wasn't quite the right question. The question we need to answer is different than the tariff question, but it was framed right.
So our task was to do a number of things, including looking at cost growth. How did we get from 485 million to 1.9 million? Look at options, look at constraints, look at priorities of the users, look at tariff impacts, look at fund sources, potential delivery methods, and we made a lot of progress on all of them. And I had been concentrating really understanding the cost growth, and I feel like I could present a coherent presentation to you on that, and there's a number of different factors. There's a combination of things that really drove that. There's material cost increases. Steel has just jumped through the roof in terms because of tariff-related things. There's 20-some% growth in materials. The lack of funding has been a problem because it hasn't allowed the team to really effectively move forward in a cost-effective manner. And every year that you push out, you're increasing escalation. When Bill presented the cost growth in the not cost growth, but the difference between the engineer's estimate and the actual bid from the contractor, there was a 30% reduction under what the contractor said the value was. And that's a factor that there was cost growth that took the cost up because they were using numbers that were based on some of their discussions with the CMGC, and those were conservative numbers, and I think that was borne out in the numbers that we saw here. And I think that'll allow for some reduction in the anticipated value. The risk allocation numbers that have increased over what they've done in the past, I haven't fully analyzed that, but the percentage increase with respect to the overall projects increased, and that's something else I want to dig into. And finally, user requests, and those are significant dollar values from what the original program that was presented to the Assembly back in November 18 to where we're at now. And so when you add up all those, you can see where a large portion of those costs have increased. So one of the things that has happened, and it's clearer to me, and it's become clearer since our last meeting, is there is a path that by alignment of the administration and the user groups, coming up with a plan and then going out into, in a unified voice to other funding, potential funders such as the state and the federal government, we could come forward with a significantly reduced cost, some of which was mentioned here by putting in fuel vaults. There's other items on the table, potentially, for example, for tote, instead of building a wharf, you could just build trestles only. So there's huge opportunities there, but in order for that to happen, there has to be discussion between the administration and the users to coalesce together around a plan, and then go out and do that presentation. So, I mean, there's a path that could be successful, but it's going to take movement on all the parties to get there. There's currently probably tension there, but there clearly is a path there. The roundtable was really good. We had there were a lot of misconceptions that got out on the table. There was good dialogue. There was some movement toward alignment. We identified constraints. We tested assumptions. We looked at requirements. But one of the things that we didn't do, and it was really disappointing to me, and I have been pushing everybody to do this, is to really sit down and look at those options that are out there and figure out what they are. And it was on our agenda for the roundtable, and it was the last item on the agenda, and unfortunately we didn't get there. And I've been pushing both sides to really focus on that, because I agree with Bill in that the sequencing of the work is challenging. Moving the PCT or moving the cement guys is that solves some of that problem, but there's other solutions there. So, for example, there have been discussions, and this has not been fully briefed, but potentially ABI would be willing to potentially sit off the port for a year, which would allow you to do construction. A lot of what's driving the current thinking is that we're pushing the wharf face out 140 feet, and that dictates a lot of things, but it creates tremendous problems. The current plan that's developed would require all of the funding for the Matson and tote berth and the portion of the North Fill to be in hand before you start that. That to me is a huge problem. Came out of the roundtable. So what has to happen to me is we need to sit down and further do this. I could do a report right now, but it's and fulfill my contractual obligations, but it doesn't have the testing of all the different user groups, all the different stakeholders like the pilots. And so what's happening is there is a meeting that's going to happen. It's probably going to be in the August time frame, or that's been the current thinking. And hopefully we'll get together, discuss those items, And so really a lot of the scope of what my contract is, if all the people in this room can get together around the table and work through these issues, that's going to write my report. And if it doesn't work, then I'll put forward what my observations and recommendations are. But the best way to do that is really at the user level and at the administration level, come up with a coherent plan that we can take, or that can be presented out to other, like the state and the feds to get money. And that's, I'm pushing in that direction. So that's kind of where I'm at. Perfect.
Mr. Peterson, Ms. Alto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is the first time I've heard that it's possible to, without building the wharf, just to build the trestles only. And I'm trying to picture that in my mind. I just don't see how that would work.
Well, that's how they do it and this is tote ships only because they roll on, roll off. But their terminal in Tacoma is built exactly like that. They don't have a wharf out in front. Now, the negative about that is you can't, other ships can't use it. It doesn't help us with our DOD port because they need a certain amount of limited face. But currently, under the current plan, the totes, their berth is like $400 and some million. You could reduce that to $100 million. So, and those are not, that's a rough number, but significant reduction in that component cost by going in that direction. Now, totes still needs to look at that. They're not totally bought into it, but that potential for those sorts of savings exists.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Alto.
Thank you. I have two questions. One, what's kind of the cost increase, percentage each year we're kind of on delay? Some of this has just been costs have gone up over time. I'm really curious in what kind of cost increase we're seeing just based on time passing. And I know some of that's dependent on tariffs and other things, but cost of goods generally tend to go up in labor and the like. So I don't know if that's possible to get, because I think that's an informative tool as we consider whether or not we're going to have additional delays or something like that. The other is, what's the deadline for us to pull the trigger for next summer so that we can kind of keep that in mind and any recommendations that we might be getting with regard to the petroleum and cement terminal? So that might be a joint question.
So the initial assumptions on escalation was 2% a year. At the time those numbers were developed, that was probably reasonable. I think that number, realistically is higher than that. And there's things like, steel and everything else that are very unpredictable. But, so the duration, the expectation of the time it will take to complete has been, significantly pushed out. I don't have an exact dollar value of that, but it is significant. I do believe that there were issues or concern about how long the contractors would be willing to have the prices. I think Bill's probably more, he probably has better information than I do on that.
Right. So on the first question on escalation, Jeff, you had to back up a little number for the petroleum cement terminal where you just multiplied it.
Jeff, we'll take it engineering. Yeah, just if we delay the petroleum and cement terminal 1 year, we estimate that's a $6 million increase, just 3% escalation for 1 year.
And the challenge there is we don't have the money in our bank account. So we were granted money in 2011, 12, 13 from the state that said you are entitled to draw down $128 million from the Treasury of the state of Alaska, but it's not in our hands. Are earning interest, and we're losing its purchasing power every year. We don't actually draw down the amount of money they said we could have. So it's a real thing. It is the thief in the night that is eating us. I will also say on that point, if we were to pause the petroleum cement terminal for a year, and we all looked at it, we measured 3 times, and then we cut once, and we said, okay, well, now we're convinced. Then we lose this $6 million, maybe more because we don't know what the price of steel is or what the bidder is going to do next time around. If the result of that pause is we want to change directions, we don't want a petroleum cement terminal, we want something else, then we have to go back to design and permitting and then construction. And that delay is going to be 3 or 4 years until we can get to the point where we're ready to build something again. So take that 1 year number and multiply it by just for escalation, 3 or 4, but there's also all the new design costs and all the permitting costs, which is the $34 million-ish that we've spent so far to get the petroleum cement terminal where it is. That was the first question on escalation. The next question was on the timeline. In the usual course of things, the assembly would be teed up to act on an open invitation to bid at the next assembly meeting, so that's July 9th now, which is why I thought we might need some more meetings between now and then. Once that bid is verified, we certainly can ask the contractor what their, no kidding, drop dead deadlines is to see if there's any play there, and we intend to have those kind of conversations. But right now, July 9th is the current time.
So,
Are we going to get any recommendations from our consultants about it in advance of July 9th?
that's what Mr. Halsey is suggesting. It's likely that we need another meeting, and so we'll probably schedule that here pretty soon. But I think that an answer back to the question of how long we can push that out, I mean, I think we have just under the procurement rules 45 days before we need to proceed even without their consent. And so, but being the only bidder, there are more flexible terms that we can negotiate with them. It might be in their benefit to wait a little bit. And so these are kind of negotiable dates that we have to work on. And again, the theme of measure twice, cut once is well heard. And so we will be having that conversation, and we'll come up with a plan, and the consultants are certainly going to be invested in coming up with the right answer. By the way, I don't know if I mentioned Ms. LaFrance entered halfway to the meeting, and Mr. Cresverde is here, but we are just about out of time. But I think as a member of the public and also as a representative of the user, I'd like to hear from Mr. Carp.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dave Carp. I'm with Saltchuk, Alaska. We have a few companies that do business at the port, but I'm here in my role as a kind of speaking on behalf of the port user group. This is a young and fledgling group, been together for about 6 to 8 weeks now. Really, I think it's important to remember we acknowledged in the roundtable that for a lot of people, this project started 14 years ago, and it was a bouncing baby project then, and now it's a rebellious teenager. And we all kind of have to deal with the fact that at some point something needs to happen. But it is interesting to note that for the first time 6-8 weeks ago, the users all came together as a collective group to start to speak with a voice and articulate concerns in a fashion that maybe lends to a little bit more productive conversation. Certainly want to acknowledge the mayor and the administration and everyone for entering into the spirit of taking feedback from the group. But really where the group is right now is we are pretty emphatic after multiple face-to-face interactions that a pause is in order. And I think what we really want to do is make a distinction between a pause and a hard stop, right? We all know stuff needs to happen, but where we're at right now is a little bit, I don't know if you've ever seen that commercial where the guy's sitting in a tattoo parlor getting his girlfriend's name tattooed on his arm, and she calls him on his cell phone and breaks up with him right as the last letter is being tattooed on his arm. It's just, to us, in terms of good public process, despite the fact that maybe we are, as a user group, late to the party, that starting a construction project, building a trestle that will ultimately have the risk of becoming a trestle to nowhere, when we don't have the money to finish the project, and we have a lot of expertise that this group is willing to bring to bear. What we've conveyed to the administration is that we are in favor of a pause. If there's a way to hold on to this bid for a season because you only have a single bidder, that's great. We don't have any problem with that. We've committed. We are meeting on a regular basis. The group is willing to dedicate resources towards making sure that it's not just a ragtag band of volunteers, but that we stay actively engaged. And we're asking and have suggested to the administration and the mayor's office that if the mayor were to empower a group of stakeholders to look at this thing from a broad and comprehensive level with a year-end mandate to come up with something that we can all get our arms and our heads and our hearts around, that's where we'd like to see this go. Yes, we realize there's time value of money, and we certainly recognize all of the hard work and the effort that's gone in by port officials and administrative officials to get this rebellious 14-year-old to where it's at. But we believe it's prudent to pause, make sure we get everybody on the same page. We have some pretty good ideas that we think we can bring to the table, but to say, okay, put them on a bar napkin and slip them across the table and we'll make our decision based on that probably isn't the best course. And with all due respect, I have a ton of respect for, and all of us do, for the dialogue and with Jason and the mayor and Bill, but where we are not agreeing is what does it mean to pause? When is a pause appropriate? We don't believe a pause is when you run out of money so you don't have a choice. We believe a pause is before you start spending money. Even if it costs us $6 million, that's that old good money after bad argument here. So as a user group, that's where we're at. We still perceive ourselves to be in constructive dialogue with the mayor's office. To get to that, we're not looking for a fight. We're looking for a constructive process, and you have the commitment on behalf of all the users of the port that we will engage actively if we can just get the time we need to make articulate, well-informed decisions, as opposed to feeling like the train's left the station and we're just trying to catch up with the caboose.
Any questions? Mr. Walton?
So why do you need a year? How about 3 months?
We don't need a year, but I think what's driving the 6 months is what we're advocating, is that's what you need in order to preserve a potential for a 2021 construction season. So we don't need a year, it's just that's what you want to do to preserve 2021 options.
Mr. Dunbar?
If we don't do that and we approve this at the next meeting or in like 2-3 months, does it start in 2020 or 2021?
2020. This scope of work.
So we do lose a year. Even if we give you 6 months, we lose a year.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's the
Make no mistake about it. That's the and it gets to the time value of money and the $6 million or whatever the number is. We as a user group believe that is a prudent risk to take. And we can all sit here. All of us, most of us, were doing something completely different 14 years ago when this process started. But here we are now, and we have an opportunity and a responsibility to do the best thing. So,
all right, Mr. Slifka was in the queue, Mr. Ballsy, and then we gotta say thank you and get started with the next.
I would just say, we've talked about $6 million for petroleum and cement. Don't forget, every year we delay is the year we delay starting the cargo. And even if you hope that we could build that for, say, $500 or $600 million, that's $20 million a year added to the cost. We know this thing is failing. We've been band-aiding it for 15 years. So we know it has to be fixed, but there's a true cost, and that number is probably closer to $20 to $25 million per year for the whole project.
But if we follow the current paradigm, we went up $900 million in a year, so we then get to the nightmare project of a $5 billion port in 5 years. And so it's hard to really suss out what the facts are, right? That's what we're doing here, is trying to figure this all out.
there's a trestle on the Tote dock that was built by Tote, funded by Tote, 16 years ago. That hasn't been a problem, and that's one of the premises that the users have. Ultimately, is this whole notion that everything is bad. There's some infrastructure there that we believe is worth looking at, and in the context of a comprehensive port plan, the reason we think the pause, and that may be that after 6 months we decide, okay, with a few tweaks here and there, we should go forward with PCT. The group is not willing to make an uninformed decision, so they're asking for time.
Mr. Ballsy.
I know we're out of time, so I'll go quick, but I want to say 2 things. The first is, I wanted to add that the involvement of Roe and Dave in the project has been nothing but good. So even though we're maybe careening towards having a loggerhead disagreement about the PCT, like, their involvement has been all very helpful. So I want to thank both of them. The second is, I get it, and when you guys are going to have a hard conversation unless we can come to an agreement, and I'm not sure we're going to be able to. So that's why we're going to have additional meetings. But I think from where we sit, if you think the pause is just going to result in our saying, yes, we've made the right decision, that is not in the public interest at all. If you think that the pause is potentially going to put us on a different track where we're not building the PCT, that's a different conversation. Right now, we are waiting for someone to put something on the table that plausibly could put us on a different track. If we're not going to end up on a different track, just waiting to get more alignment, I think, is not to the good.
Right, and I can appreciate that. That makes sense. So with that, I'm sorry we're out of time. We have to switch over to the budget and finance committee. And this is a very interesting conversation going on months. And we're coming to a point where we're going to have a tough policy decision to make. And so with that, we're good.